Hi, guys. Good afternoon. So, we're going to try to talk about what's happening in the world of applied AI, okay? And if I can take you all back to November 2022, when ChatGPT happened, it was a very profound moment because it was for the first time you had a technology where every CEO in every industry in every country was trying to figure out what to do with this. And you knew technology was going to diffuse fast. This was sort of a major transformation opportunity. And as a backdrop, the world's got a lot of issues it's been working through. We've had social media issues around polarization and nationalism. We've been dealing with a pandemic. We've been dealing with energy crisis and war. And so it was one of those moments where it requires you to be highly intentional about what we're going to do with technology over the next 20 to 30 years. And what we'll try to cover today is trying to frame what that opportunity is for Europe, and how I think you all need to be thinking about stepping up to that opportunity as well. So I think with that, maybe, Jeannette, just to get started about this, you wrote a book that you recently published, The New European Renaissance, that just won the German Book Prize. Congratulations. Talk a little bit about what the motivation was for that book and how you're thinking about Europe's opportunity in this moment.
Yeah. First of all, we actually both wrote books. I'm going to trigger HT on that right after. But I did indeed write that book. And I think it was kind of the moment where AI really became real. It was also the moment in time where defense technology all of a sudden became real and became a thing that really kind of activated across the ecosystem. And I think it was also a moment in time where I felt like Europe just needed to kind of activate its confidence level around what we're actually capable of doing, because we have such amazing people here and such amazing founders. And I just wanted to kind of create a framework as to how I think all these pieces fit together. So first of all, I actually talked about how diffusion of AI can be actually the biggest lever for European prosperity over the next decades, and how this is a real moment where Europe actually can lead. You know, in prior technologies, we were actually ill-equipped. If you think about the internet age, where we're just too fragmented as a market to actually, truly create global winners. And then I think that then catalyzed the cloud, where we just didn't have the capital base and the ecosystem built to actually, reap benefits from that. I think that is changing with AI. I think AI is actually probably the biggest lever we have to onshore productivity. Think about the service sector, think about all sort of industries where essentially labor gets melted into compute. Think about taking back jobs that are elsewhere in the world, in customer support, for example. And so this is one lever we have to really boosting our GDP and really boosting our productivity. And then secondly, we are seeing a lot of challenges. You just alluded them in the context of health, in the context of manufacturing, in the context of energy. And the world is looking at Europe right now, and they're saying, oh God, what's going on? We're looking at Europe saying, oh my God, what's going on? There's so much opportunity because these problems are like large-scale problems. And large-scale problems are usually also large-scale TAMs, right? So you can build giant companies there. And so I think I reflected a little bit about what does it actually take to build in these industries? What does it take to build in defense? I walked through the example of housing, which we can maybe talk about later as well. And a lot of the companies we've built and been early backers in. And I do think that there's a creation activation playbook for Europe that can activate now. And I think that also requires a bit of a mindset shift outside from, we are kind of just beaten down by the world saying, oh, what's happening in Europe, to actually, we have some of the brightest minds. If you think about the Nobel Prize winners in AI, they're actually European. And we have great talent that previously had to build in Europe and then had to go to the US to kind of really capture the sizable market share. So a lot of the talent, was kind of flowing out of Europe. Now we're seeing the talent come back, and we're seeing the talent actually be able to capture a lot more opportunity faster. So that's exciting.
Yeah, so I think if you listen to the problems that we're talking about here in terms of where the opportunities in Europe, transforming the services sector, defense, manufacturing, these are not problems you can take on with a traditional venture capital mindset. And in fact, I would even argue, when we were talking about combining La Familia and General Catalyst, a lot of the dialogue was that venture is too niche for what Europe really needs. There's not enough capital that was getting funded, and the scope of these problems is actually fairly large and fairly complex. In fact, if you take a step back and say every country is thinking about how do you transform in today's world of need for resiliency and artificial intelligence as a potential solution, you're thinking about, from our perspective, we've had a lot of conversations with sovereign leaders, 4 different things. One is, what is AI-enabled deterrence going to look like? You were mentioning Helsinki. I think we should talk about that. I think the second thing is very much about, we went through a pandemic, how do we make sure we're resilient so that this doesn't happen again? We are much more sophisticated in how we handle the risks around a pandemic. The third is about diffusion of AI. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. I would actually argue, just seeing on the ground what's happening with companies, that 2025 is a year that diffusion of AI truly began. And there's a lot of on-the-ground perspective, and it has implications. And the fourth is reskilling, because if we're truly going to start adopting AI, it's going to impact workforce. So why don't we talk about these sort of one at a time? I think defense has been a core focus for you. You recently wrote the Sparta paper. You guys sort of laid out a vision for how Europe should be thinking about defending, role of innovation. Talk about what's interesting, how you're approaching it. Talk about Helsinki. Just give some context on what's going on.
Yeah, first of all, I think you actually ignited the whole defense thesis at GC already 22 years ago. So I think it's like something you actually pioneered.
Yeah, in the US, we've been investing in defense since 2004. And then we also seeded Anduril. But I think for Europe, just given all the implications of the geopolitics, it needs to become much more independent. And so, talk about like what needs to happen there.
Yeah. So actually, I think it's cool to do that, have that conversation in Finland. I think it's just awesome how much you guys are just kind of really have resiliency and sort of sovereignty baked into your DNA. I actually feel that everywhere in founder conversations I'm having. And I think this is actually not to be taken for granted. I think it's actually I think the Ukraine war has been an awakening moment. We actually were seed investors in Helsinki, and I was probably one of the first people that the founders spoke to about the opportunity at a time where that was not hot and sexy at all. It was actually something that people were very wary of, and it was actually considered almost like a no-touch type thing. And so I think the real shift that is happening currently is that we just need to activate so fast, and the urgency is that it's getting unlocked there is actually our opportunity. I really think the urgency and the technological shift we're seeing with AI, that in combination is actually a giant opportunity. Now, I think the question is, what does it need for that opportunity to become real? So one is obviously government procurement. So you need government spending to rise. So one thing we did at the beginning of the year is with a whole group of friends and sort of like-minded folks, we actually launched the Sparta initiative, which had one objective to make sure Germany specifically increases its defense spend, which landed. So we actually pushed for a 500 billion package to be unlocked over the next 5 years, which is pretty tremendous. Actually, the largest net new spend in Europe right now. That also means that's the largest market for European founders wanting to sell defense technology, because that's net new spending that gets built. And so starting there, you had that locked, which was great, with our new government coming in. Second step was the kind of FT, how to spend it. So how do you actually think about architecting a deterrence stack that's credible? I was actually recently asked, when do we know that Europe is able to defend itself? And I think the simple answer is it's ready to defend itself if nobody gets to enter our borders without our permission, right? And right now we're talking and we have to chase people out, and that is not the way it should be. So the question was, what is a credible deterrence stack and how should governments prepare for that? And so we actually outlined an architecture that really starts with space surveillance, that then goes down to sort of air defense systems, down to sort of anything that's land-based, down to the supply chain that needs to get built to power all these new systems, these software-defined mass hardware devices like drones or underwater drones and sort of agile robots in the field. But then also really think through what ties it all together. Like, where do you integrate, and where do you actually build new systems? So all that has to come together, and governments need to understand that. And I think that is something that we then really leaned into with our GC Institute and with the Sparta initiatives particularly, because in defense it's always like a binary bet. It's like you get a multi-billion-dollar contract or you get nothing. And that multi-billion-dollar contract often comes down to do you have the right amount of stakeholders really educated towards what they need to buy and how they should think about it. So to give you an example, Germany recently procuring 26 billion for frigates. doesn't make sense when you look at Ukraine, where 95% of the entire war is actually driven by autonomous systems. So that is, I think, what we're doing in defense. It informs a lot of my work with Helsing and a lot of our other sort of portfolio companies in the defense space. And it's actually interesting to see how our portfolio is currently shaping up and how many synergies we can now unlock off the back of that.
Yeah. So defense is the first pillar. Second pillar is actually healthcare. And we're seeing a lot of adoption of AI in health. And one of the main reasons is because the workforce is extremely burnt out due to COVID. In every other industry, you bring AI in, the workforce creates inertia because they're like, what does it mean for our jobs? In healthcare, they're very focused on, we're so underwater that we need the help. And I think Europe's actually especially positioned in healthcare to lead because there's a huge pharma ecosystem. And as you think about the development of next generation drugs and therapies, AI can be an enormous enabler. So the third pillar is about the diffusion of AI in enterprises. And one thing I really admire about the way, we won't work together for that long, but the way you've been approaching it is you're really putting your money where your mouth is. You bring your heart and soul into it. You're not using a let's invest in Europe as an inbound marketing campaign, as a lot of investors I see doing on social media. You're really trying to create systems. And one of those has been around AI for you. Talk about why leadership in AI is important for Europe's global leadership in business.
Yeah. So, I mean, we discussed earlier how the diffusion AI is actually critical for Europe. I think startups are the new institutions of tomorrow. And I say institutions because for me, a seed founder walking through my door, building something in AI, I can extrapolate it and see what this could build in terms of our sort of GDP contribution. Because if you think about the gap we have to the US right now, it's about 12 trillion. Like that is essentially the entirety of the market cap of these large technology companies that got built in the last era. So how do we make sure, A, that gap doesn't widen, but maybe gets closed? And I think the AI is the answer to that. And that comes down to making sure it gets diffused as fast as possible. And a lot of that actually depends on customers buying the right technology, right? And it's interesting because AI right now, there's a whole new supply chain that gets built everywhere, right? In the US, here. And so you want to make sure our customers, which in many cases are large established industry companies, actually understand what is out there, how to think about that transformation, and then secondly, lean onto local startups and companies that are European, if and where possible, and if and where they're competitive and equally great. And I think we have many amazing companies here. And so in February, we actually launched something called the European AI Champions Initiative, which is the largest collaboration or platform that got established between European innovators and adopters of AI. And by adopters, I mean anything from SAP, Siemens, Stellantis, Mercedes, like all these large, Novo Nordisk, all these very large companies, or Ilka from Supercell, was there as well, if you want to call them like a big company. And then you have a lot of these innovators, all the AI companies that we have in Europe, and they all came together to kind of create a shared ecosystem. And so we announced it in February with 12 European heads of states, and it's like a 3 trillion combined in market capitalization that is essentially a forced collision of how we can learn from each other and how can we distribute AI as fast as possible within our ecosystem.
Yesterday, you hosted President Macron, Chancellor Merz, a lot of these CEOs that you're mentioning, large companies and startups. What's the progress been around this innovation and adoption ecosystem of AI?
Yeah.
How are we doing?
Yeah, so it's cool. First of all, yesterday was fun. So we had actually, the leaders of France and Germany sit there at the table with our startups, with sort of our initiative partners coming together to announce deals. So since February, we have over 20 billion that actually got allocated in terms of investment and in terms of partnerships that got created within that initiative. And alone yesterday, we actually announced 1 billion in partnership volume. That was just one day, and that was across sort of 18 partnerships that got built. So Mistral and SAP, Helsing and Mistral was one of them, Mercedes and Black Forest Labs. There was just a flurry of announcements. And the interesting thing is, with these sort of trigger moments that look like they're like a press moment, what actually happens is that everybody gangs up and said, okay, how do we make sure this deal that we've been maybe ideating over the past weeks now actually gets done? So we actually pushed a lot of that. And that is, for me, what is really required to activate Europe. We need this, and you spoke about this in your book as well, like this flywheel And the way to really make sure we get a tight coalition between policy, because you need policymakers to like actually buy our technology across all the things we just mentioned. And then you need capital providers like us who can go from seed all the way to really deploying large capital. And we've deployed 2 billion. Since we got together into European technology. Then you need industry, which is a lot of these adopters I just mentioned, and you need startups, like all these founders here, kind of coming together and actually combusting outcomes. And I think that's really why we came together and why it's so much fun to build this.
I think it's remarkable to watch, and I actually think it's really necessary because the applied AI opportunity very much is about, in some ways, melting labor into productivity. And if you're not going to capture that productivity gain onshore, here in Europe, you're hollowing out your economy of services just like we hollowed out manufacturing. This is the same theme that we're thinking a lot about in the US as we're investing, and it's actually very paramount for Europe. And then, so, defense, health, diffusion of AI, and the last pillar is really reskilling. And reskilling is an incredibly important a topic because workforce is going to change. If you apply call centers to healthcare and you create an agentic workforce that's effectively going to be very deflationary and cheap, you can take care of people in a fundamentally different way. Because you don't have to triage and labor becomes really cheap, so you can call all your elderly every day and check up on them. Changes the care model. That's abundance. But think about on the other side, the same call center technology, all the middle class jobs created in countries like Philippines are going to disappear because we're going to onshore those jobs back with AI productivity. So reskilling is going to be really important on one side, how to drive abundance. On the other side, how do you think about jobs for people that are going to be taken over by AI? I know that's increasingly of concern here in Europe as well. Like, how are you thinking about it here? Like, what are the kinds of things that the people in the room that are thinking about addressing it as entrepreneurs should be thinking about as well?
First of all, I think it's so cool how you're kind of driving this globally with our GC Institute to really create an innovation framework around that. But second of all, I think it's actually really something that Europe, and especially Germany, is actually real well designed for. We actually are proud to say that we have a social market economy to begin with, which I think is a good starting point. Second of all, Germany has like a long history of an apprenticeship system. So we actually have this whole sort of upskilling, reskilling motion sort of already somewhat baked, and it's not a novel concept per se. The question is how can you repurpose it and actually make sure that activates. We actually have a company, Multiverse, that is now thinking about applying that in Germany, because Germany actually has a large sort of pool of capital designed for that, and I think it's a huge opportunity for founders to build in. It's actually a cool idea also to think about how can people become lifelong learners on the job. I think of like, if you're a curious mind, it's actually an amazing concept. And then I do think it's a very necessary lever to stabilize our democracies, because if we don't make sure these people feel like they have a way to lean into technology and become fearful of it, I think that will create a lot of societal problems. And I think it's something that you wrote about in your book as well.
I really think reskilling is the issue of the next decade, and we have to innovate way out of it. Okay, so we talked about the framework for transformation. On the other side, when we think about investing, because ultimately startups are the most important institutions that are going to drive change, technology innovation is the answer over the next 20 years for this applied AI transformation. You have, since we combined GC and La Familia, talked a lot about and have had a profound impact on us becoming very much seed first in our venture capital business orientation. Connect the dots for folks around, we talk about these systemic changes, and then we say, well, seed has to be where we have to begin to start. Why is that?
Yeah, well, first of all, you should answer that question, because you were in seed of Stripe and Admiral, and like you kind of started and ignited a lot of the companies that are already kind of the big ones. So I'm first going to prompt you on this.
Well, I think so. To me, there's two separate things. One is in the venture capital ecosystem, all the good firms are fighting for the zero-sum game of the elite founders, and whoever gets to get in business with them ends up getting profound returns from the power law companies, and the flywheel continues. I mean, that's what the business has been. But I think in Europe, to me, seed need to be much more about intentionality.
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Because here, how do you think about, because you have to solve these mega problems, and sort of starting there, talk through sort of how how and why that's really important for a.
So here you guys are hearing the
us.
pitch that he's given me at the time. I'm joking. Actually, so Hemant has been like one of the first guys I actually met when I started in venture. I knew that I knew nothing. I was like, okay, I'm going to the Valley. Who are the smartest people I can meet? One of them was him, and so we've actually collaborated for many years. And then we were actually thinking through how's the nature of venture capital changing, right? First of all, I think we're seeing the big problems I mentioned earlier and the big opportunities that require very different, more flexible sort of capital solutions. So you really need to think through what type of capital, what type of tooling is needed to really drive big outcomes, and what does it take to co-conspire with founders in the most agile ways. And that's something that fascinated me. And I think we're just, in general, like seed for me is not a stage, it's actually a passion. It's actually just something like, it's almost like a belief. And it's also something you have to fundamentally love. I personally love the ambiguity. I love the creativity. I love the chaos. I thrive in that. So it's something that I think is just naturally brought in. And I think for us, it's like, the question is like, do you look at it as, oh, it's a $2 million check or whatever the capital requirements are? And we're seeing 2 billion seed rounds now. And I actually want to prompt you on that. What do you think about these things that are going on there? But it's a question of how do you actually create the best founder experience at seed, and how do you make sure you kind of really go founder first. And by that we mean really leaning onto that person. I always say best founders might not succeed the first time, but they won't fail. And I think that's a small but very meaningful difference, because leaning on a person and just seeing the trajectory of people is something that I think we both subscribe to. And so we have many ways to co-conspire with founders, and we've seen a lot of trajectories with founders, and we should talk about some of them as well, where they came in with one company, the company didn't work out, we helped it land it somewhere else, we actually then hatched a company with that person that became really big. And so there's so many of these avenues where once you start sort of building relationship and really building deep relationships with founders and getting in the weeds with them, then you can really drive these big outcomes. And trust that is required to do that really starts at seed. And so that's kind of why I'm really excited for our partnership, because what's happening here is we really made seed a core performance strategy within GC. We've really designed the whole platform to be seed first, and we're seeing that with my amazing partners Yuri that we brought on board in the US and Neeraj from India, who are all started seed firms, and they are all in the same spirit of okay, like let's think through this boutique mindset. Let's hold on to that because that's so precious, and then really think about how do we supercharge from there, which is amazing. But walk us a little bit through what you're seeing in the US. Speaking of seed rounds of 2 billion plus that are happening these days.
Yeah. So I think look, there's a U.S. as a country. You can judge it for whether it makes sense or not. It's actually making a venture capital bet on AI. 50% of our GDP growth is AI, and at the very meta layer, if you were to be a simple investor, you would say, let's just buy an index of OpenAI, Anthropic, and Gemini/Google. But what's happening is so many research teams are getting funded with these extraordinary amounts to invest in compute and see if there's other new kinds of models that can be commercially interesting. That is, is some of that going to work? Is it not? Very hard to tell, but some things will. But a lot of money will also potentially be lost because those are not commercial efforts in a lot of ways. And then you have all this applied AI work, like we talked about. All the jobs in a business are transforming. All the jobs in manufacturing are transforming. And so there's a lot of seed activity happening there where founders are thinking about starting companies that essentially melt labor into productivity, as I said earlier. That is a very robust part of it. But in Europe, I sort of look at it and say the volume of companies is not that much. But when you have an Helsinki or when you have a Mistral, Europe needs its deterrence leadership. Europe needs its own AI models. So you can't think of these as just seed. And I think to your point, the flexible capital to make sure you can will these founders into success to be category-defining companies for Europe's resiliency, I think that's strategically really important. Yeah. And
I think maybe on that point, like looking at the companies like Ligora or Parloa that we have in the portfolio, they go global from day one, and they have steeper growth curves than what we're sometimes seeing in the US, and that should make all of us very confident.
Yeah. Look, my parting advice for all of you is this is peak ambiguity, and there's an enormous amount of advantage in terms of the kinds of companies we can build, but you also have to be very open-minded to what those businesses are going to look like, because geopolitics keeps changing and the capabilities of the technology keep changing. So you have to have a flexible mind in how you build these companies, and I think that iterative nature is going to be very handy, and sort of developing deep relationships with customers versus being dogmatic about your product is going to be the key to succeeding in this next generation. Thank you.
Awesome. Good to see you.